Hello and welcome to Healing After Suicide Loss, the interview series on how to find peace, make life livable again, and move forward one day at a time. I created the series to give you all a go-to place with plenty of helpful resources, advice, and encouragement from those who are experts in their field to help you move forward with your life. Let's make a deal. Commit to taking one action after you watch this interview. Because time alone doesn't heal all wounds. You need to work through your grief to make life livable again. I'm your host, Carolin Brookings, and with me today is Sara Cobb. Sara was called to connect fellow grievers with resources for healing after her own trauma of loss, following the tragic deaths of her two older brothers, 43 years apart, one by freak accident and one in murder-suicide. Sara is the founder of My Grief Connection, a hub of grief resources and a growing community of support for grievers. Her passion and advocacy for grief and mental health education grew from a combination of her interests, strengths, and life experiences. Sara finds meaning by sharing her story of mending from the wounds of sibling and suicide bereavement and guiding others toward tools and resources that offer hope and healing after loss. In fall of 2021, she returned to university to pursue a Master's of Science in Counseling Education with a focus on clinical mental health counseling and grief and trauma. And I'm so happy that she's here talking with us today. Welcome, Sara. Tell us a bit more about your story and how you got here.
Thank you, Caro. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really honored to be included in this masterclass series, and it's really a pleasure to speak with you today and share with your listeners about my story. Looking back on my life, I can see that I got here into this space of grief and loss because of an accumulation of events that happened in the world, also in my family's history as well, before I was born, and mixed with my own life experiences. I was actually born into a grieving family. My oldest brother, Stephen, died in an accidental electrocution when he was just shy of 7 years old. The incident was also witnessed by my brother, Sky, and he was only 4 at the time, so it was very traumatic. It was a pretty gruesome sight for him to witness. And, I never got to meet Stephen because I was born 11 months after he died. So my family was really going through this acute grieving process while they were expecting my birth. And, I grew up always knowing about Stevie, and they didn't keep it from me. We talked about him. I saw pictures. We told stories. So he was always part of our family, and I always knew about him. But as I got older and when I grew into an adult, looking back, I could start to really see that the trauma of his death really shaped our family dynamic and had a big influence on me and how I developed and how I saw the world and how I saw myself too. And then fast forward 43 years, and the thing that actually really brought me to face my own personal and profound grief was the death of my older brother, Sky, 3 years ago in a murder-suicide. So on July 5th, 2018, my afternoon at work was interrupted by a call from my dad. And this call divided my life into before and after. Dad, spoke in his shaky voice. He was upset, I could tell. I didn't know what was going on, but he had to tell me that, Sara, I hate to have to tell you this over the phone, but the police found Skylar and Chrissy's bodies in their house. They're both gone, and we don't know many details yet, but there was a gun involved, and they're both dead. So I was absolutely stunned and shocked. It was just a moment that has, changed my life forever, for sure. It turned out that about 2 days after my birthday, very late on the night of the 4th, or maybe very early on the morning of the 5th of July, 2018, we don't know the exact time, he ended up kind of spiraling into his worst moment. What I imagine, to him probably felt like a combination of despair and hopelessness, pain, anger, just a lot of emotions mixed all up. And so desperately seeking a way out of years of physical and emotional pain and trauma that he had been through. And in the immediate wake of the breakup of his most intimate and important relationship, he cycled into a bipolar hypomanic episode that was exacerbated by alcohol that day. And he acted extremely impulsively and shot and killed his fiance. And then right after that, took his own life. And they were discovered the next day by her best friend. So, when I got the news that this happened, my world turned upside down and I was just forever changed. I really struggled for quite a while after his death to just function and to try to piece together kind of this new reality in some way that made sense and that would allow me to kind of move forward. And thankfully, a few months after his death, I connected with a really good counselor that knew how to treat trauma and grief. And she was a really good fit for me and has helped me so much over the last 2.5 years. And I did pretty intense therapy for about 6 to 8 months and continued to do regular sessions with her. After digging I finally found a local suicide loss support group about 9 months or so after my brother's death, and I started attending that regularly, and that's been very helpful. Just talking with other people who have been through something that was somewhat similar to my loss really helped me and helped me feel more connected and feel like I was part of a community, and that was a big step for me, fitting into that sort of community piece of it. So the first year of my loss, I really spent countless hours, doing counseling, reading, journaling about grief, trying to move my emotions through my body. Went on lots of walks and did dance classes and started trying to create art to help me express some of my emotions. And I received a lot of body work and just did a lot of prayer, meditation, and spiritual work, and pursued other healing modalities. And then I also just used a lot of my research skills that I've acquired from years of working at a public library and doing reference. And I have a hobby of genealogy, so I'm pretty good at digging and doing research. And with those skills, I kind of started to compile a lot of these grief resources that I found. And I tried to find resources on murder-suicide loss. I was trying to find support for that. And there just really is not much out there at all. And I, complained to my counselor about how hard it was to find grief support resources in one place, especially for murder-suicide loss. There was not much of anything. She really empathized with me about that, but she also kind of challenged me a little bit and asked if maybe there was something that I could do to help solve that or to come up with a solution for that. And at first I was a little annoyed about it because I was like, I'm the one that's, needing the help and I'm hurting. And, why do I have to do the labor, to do this? But after I thought about it for a few weeks, I really decided that she was right. And I realized, that if I wanted a solution and I wanted to be part of helping other people find help, that this could be a great way to do that. And I could create something that would be helpful for others, but also for myself. That process of creating this resource has been really helpful for me. And so just inspired by her and by also wanting to honor my brother and his fiance, I spent the first anniversary of their deaths creating the My Grief Connection website. I spent about 6 hours in a cafe just trying to figure out the basics of how to make a web page, how to add links and stuff. I just made a basic page that had just some links to some groups, some articles, some books and other resources and tools that I had found helpful that I thought, these might be helpful for others, and kind of put them all in a central location. And I hit publish at the end of the day. And that's what I did that day to honor and remember them on that 1 year mark. And shortly after that, I started a Facebook page and an Instagram account and just began sharing on there as well and starting to build up a community of grievers wanting to support each other. And that fall, I told my story publicly at a walk that raised money for suicide prevention and awareness. And just since then, I've just been continuing to build my grief connection, and I started a support group for murder-suicide loss survivors. I've been speaking at some community events, on podcasts and summits and webinars and things like that, just to try to help get the word out there and let people know that there are resources and that there are others that want to connect and want to to be of help, and that there's, there's a big grief community out there, and that there's hope as well, and there's hope that they can actually find their own personal path for healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm so grateful, and I really appreciate you sharing your story, especially as a murder suicide loss survivor, because now I've come across a lot of people lost someone to suicide, and we know how much stigma is attached to that, and then adding another layer of the actual murder suicide on top of it. Now, I can only imagine how much more complex the grieving must be, and how much more stigma is attached to that. So I'm so grateful that you're working through your grief, and all the resources that you find for yourself that have helped you, providing for other people, and also the group and everything, to make sure that everyone's supported. Yeah. So let's talk to those people who long to find peace after losing a loved one to suicide or in a murder suicide, and who don't want that to be on the forefront of their mind all the time. So can you tell us a little bit more about how it was like to lose your brother in a murder suicide?
I mean, losing my brother was truly just the most devastating thing that I've ever been through. It's the hardest thing I've ever done has been surviving this loss. And it was just such a shock, and it was so heartbreaking to our whole family, and of course, to his fiance's family as well. I mean, and my family was devastated for them, and we felt so much of a burden and guilt over what happened to her. And it's just such an unspeakable kind of, heavy loss. And to have it be your own person that takes someone else's life, that's really hard. It's really hard because you want to, there's so much of a puzzle there that you want to figure out as to why this happened, and how couldn't we see that there was something going on, and how could we have helped? Like, is there a way, like there's all those kind of issues, which I know that comes up in suicide loss as well. It's not just the murder part, but the murder part, there's an extra victim, at least one, usually, and sometimes more than one. And so it's very, very complicated. And all of their friends and our relatives and stuff, everyone that knew them were just absolutely shaken as well. And people don't know how to support you in this kind of loss. It's very upsetting for everybody, and people don't know what to say and how to react and how to be supportive, at least not past like those initial first few weeks, of bringing food and saying, I'm so sorry for your loss, and maybe sending a card. But I find that, yes, that's pretty typical in all kinds of grief, but it seems like in murder suicide loss, there's a bit more of that stigma piece attached to it, that makes it harder for people to reach out and continue to give support. So that's been very hard, of course. Some people, have just sort of dropped out of the picture, and just or never say anything about it, or never mention him, or anything like that. And that's really a hard thing. It feels like your person is just sort of, disappeared, and like they weren't, that people aren't remembering them, the good parts of them, that they're just remembering the way that they died. And that's really hard. Because he died in this horrible way, and he did this awful thing at the end of his life, but it doesn't define who he was as a person and how he lived the rest of his life. It's hard. It's hard for people to separate that, I think, and then it makes it difficult for them to give really effective support, because they get those things sort of mixed up. And I still can't really fully wrap my mind around what happened, and I don't know that I ever will, really. There's just a lot of questions, and I've certainly come to some acceptance about what's happened and the reality of it, but it's still difficult to understand. And I've imagined the scene and kind of the things that led up to what happened based on the facts that we know, and the things that I know about who he was and who she was and their relationship and all of those things, so many times. But eventually I came to realize that even if I had been there and witnessed it, or if we had a video, or, you know, I could magically have all of my questions answered as to why and when and how and all of that, I still wouldn't be satisfied with those answers, because it wouldn't solve what happened. It wouldn't bring them back, and I'd still miss them. So I just have had to come to, you know, a place of just accepting that, you know, maybe some answers will be revealed more with time or whatever. I don't know, but if they're not, that that's okay, and it doesn't it won't help. Even if they did, really, it wouldn't really solve the problem. But it's, you know, it's just a really surreal experience to lose two people that you love so much at once in this really unthinkable way. It would have been a very different experience, I think, if they had died in a car accident, or, you know, some other way, you know, if it had been someone who broke in that killed them, you know. Very different experience of processing the grief and going, and all the emotions and things that would come up from that. So it's just interesting how the method makes such a big difference in the way that we grieve and how that we feel, and the way that others support us as well makes a big difference. You know, the perception that people have and the way that they judge the situation and how they feel they can show up for us makes a difference. The method. And you know, yeah, it's just really hard to understand for me, knowing my brother the way I did, and what a loving person he was. It's hard to reconcile, you know, what he did with how I knew him and how I knew his character. It seems so out of character what he did. And, you know, the violence and the suddenness of this kind of death really had the effect of kind of an emotional grenade going off in my life. It felt like, you know, just everything sort of just all over the place, and then you have to kind of do the work of gathering yourself back together, and there's no putting it back together like it was before. There's a new thing that's created. You know, and all the roles and responsibilities in our family kind of changed a lot, shifted in some ways that I didn't expect. You know, I counted on my brother to be with me in my life, you know, and to be here to celebrate the big and small things in life, and to be a support and a helper and a friend. And I counted on him to be there for, you know, the holidays and the birthdays and my weddings and graduations and all those things. And I imagined that he and my younger brother and I would work together to help support our parents as they age, and you know, to support each other when one day they die as well. So it's just really still hard to picture, you know, going forward with the rest of life without him sometimes. Just thinking of all the ways that he's really missed, and the things he's missed out on, and the things he will miss in the future. Like those are really difficult. And I don't know, when I think about losing a sibling is kind of its own thing. I mean, there's the murder-suicide loss, but then there's sibling loss part as well. And I've heard this phrase before, and I found it makes sense to me that when a parent dies, you lose the past. When a child dies, you lose the future. When a sibling dies, you lose the past and the future. You know, and to me that really rings true, because you know, he was there from the beginning for me before I was born. You know, he was excited to have a little sister, and you know, he knows all this stuff about me that nobody else knows and remembers, all these little things. And it's weird to have like part of my history just be lost because he's gone. You know, he remembered things about my life that I don't even remember sometimes. Like, he had such an amazing memory. Yeah, it's just been, it's hard to describe, I guess, what it's like to lose a sibling in this way.
Yeah,
it's hard. And you know, there's also some feelings of abandonment, I guess, and fear of losing others in kind of unforeseen and sudden ways that comes when you lose someone kind of traumatically like this. And I know I had a lot of guilt as well, survivor's guilt, you know, and also just feeling like there was this burden of responsibility on me as his sister, you know, to try to kind of atone for what he did, and to try to make things right in the universe, you know, somehow magically. And you know, I thankfully I realized after a while that that wasn't possible, and it's not my job to do that. But I think that that's something that a lot of murder-suicide loss survivors probably feel, this burden to try to make right what was wrong. And the thing with murder-suicide loss is that a lot of times survivors loved both people involved, or maybe there's multiple people. A lot of times there's multiple victims. But sometimes it can be, if you lose your parents in a murder-suicide, or a sibling, or and their spouse or their significant other, or other multiple family members, things like that. That's so difficult because you're grieving both people, and one is probably what we would call the perpetrator, and one the victim. And so there's different grief that you feel for both of those people or those roles. There's a lot of anger probably that can be involved, especially with the perpetrator. And it's hard because a lot of times, you love that person, but then you're also really mad at them for what they did. So it's very complex and very layered. Murder-suicide loss can be, and there's so many different instances and iterations of how it happens and who can be affected by it. But it's very complicated for sure.
Yeah, it sounds to me like all the complex grief and everything that we're feeling by losing a loved one to suicide is magnified and exacerbated when a murder-suicide is involved. That's what it sounds to me like.
Yeah.
And you've already touched on it a little bit, but can you tell us a bit more how, in your view, a murder-suicide loss is different from any other suicide loss?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's similar in a lot of ways. There's a lot of commonalities between, the feelings that you feel, the types of grief, I guess, but feelings that come up are pretty similar. But yeah, there's definitely additional factors because there's this homicide component, and sometimes, like I said, there could be multiple victims, and yeah, it's just a lot to process, with multiple people involved, and like I said, having those relationships oftentimes with both the victim and the perpetrator makes it just really difficult to navigate, and you might feel I don't know, let's see. Yeah, I mean, it's just very layered and complex, and there's things that make it very difficult to talk. I mean, suicide loss itself is very hard to talk about often. It's hard for us to feel like we are allowed to speak about our people. But, when there's this added criminal kind of component to it where they committed a crime in the process, I think that can make murder-suicide loss victims really shut down even more because there's so much embarrassment, I guess, and this feeling of needing to isolate and to not wanting to really talk about it, and how speaking it out loud, saying what happened can feel so hard. And I know of victims who have kept it secret for years, and even from close friends and family, just didn't feel like they could really say what happened. Yeah. And that's a really difficult thing because it makes grieving so much harder. There's so much shame attached to it, and when there's shame and that feeling of judgment or embarrassment or whatever, that really is hard on a person's soul to hold for very long. It really eats away at you. There's just, yeah, there's a lot to that, and it's just hard because people aren't speaking about murder-suicide loss, really. I mean, I think I'm one of the very few out there that's kind of talking about this, and so it feels like you're so alone and isolated. There's support for suicide loss, not as much as we would like, of course, but there are organizations and groups and people, and people like you that are helping others with suicide loss. So there are some resources for that, but there really isn't much at all for murder-suicide loss, like very, very, very little. And I think that just adds to people's feeling of shame and judgment, because it feels like that we don't deserve to have support, and also I think we're just not really allowed to fully grieve. We have to grieve in private, and that's also made difficult because the media likes to sensationalize these stories. So oftentimes when these cases happen, they're in the news, and that news cycle keeps coming back around. And anytime there's another case or incident or something like that, even months down the line, sometimes the news will mention, the previous story or whatever. And so you're trying to grieve, you're trying to go deal with it and stuff, but then and just when you start to feel like you're maybe coming to terms or feeling a little bit better, then the media brings it up again, or something like that happens, and it makes it really difficult. And I think also there's so much judgment attached to how the media relays these stories and how they talk about the perpetrator, and how almost a lot of the times they just sort of say, like, they give it this domestic violence label, which I agree sometimes that's warranted, and oftentimes that is the case. There's domestic violence issues, and of course it is an incident of domestic violence, but that doesn't, when they label it like that, it's people make all kinds of assumptions about what happened and what the relationship was like without knowing the individuals or knowing kind of the backstory or the dynamics in the relationship. And so there's your person is being labeled as abusive, but then also as this murderer and other horrible things. And that's so hurtful, when that's not really their true character. People make mistakes, and we do horrible things sometimes in these awful moments, and sometimes we can't take back those mistakes or undo that hurt that we've done, but that shouldn't totally define who we are.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's difficult. There's a lot to deal with, especially with the media, and then there's also legal issues that can really come up for survivors of murder-suicide loss. Sometimes the family of the perpetrator might get sued for wrongful death, or they could get just tangled up in like all this probate and estate issues that can go on forever, and that further kind of exacerbates the pain and makes it harder to kind of move through some of the grief, because these things keep coming back up, that they have to deal with, and it can get very complicated. And there's really not a lot of support out there to help them kind of work through all the legal things. Sometimes you can feel really betrayed by the perpetrator, and you can feel like maybe I didn't know them as well as I thought they did. So that's a difficult thing, I think, that we have to work through in murder-suicide loss, and to some degree I think just in suicide loss as well. Sometimes especially if it's just like there were no warning signs and all of a sudden this happens, you can feel that feeling of did I really know them, and that's definitely a complicated thing to work through. There's also lots of family drama, and everyone reacts differently to grief. We all grieve differently, and we all react differently to kind of these sort of traumatic situations. So that can be a very complicated thing to work through. And some families, people might want to talk about it and or get help, and other people are just like, nope, shut it down. I don't want to talk about it. Like, we'll never mention them again. We don't, talk about them. Like, they're shunned basically from the family because they did this thing. So that can definitely be a thing that happens after this type of loss.
Yeah.
And then, just a lot of labeling that goes on. There's black and white thinking and labeling. We call perpetrator, victim. There's not really a lot of gray area there. And, so that can definitely be difficult too, especially if it's not cut and dry. Sometimes these cases aren't cut and dry. They're more complicated and nuanced than we think they are about what and how happened and who did what. And sometimes the police get it wrong in these investigations, and and there's a lot up in the air and people don't know what really happened, but there's this need that we have to kind of label everything and to know what happened and put it in boxes and be able to report on it and all of that stuff. So, I mean, I know from some people, from survivors that I've talked to that have been kind of in a situation where it's like, it wasn't really clear, like who was the perpetrator and who was the victim here. That's very complicated and hard. And they may not ever get, definitive answers on what really happened. That's something that they have to live with, and come to some sort of acceptance with. Yeah, I don't know. Those are some of the main things that come to my mind, with this question about the differences. But I'm sure there's more. But those are a few.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's so many layers upon layers of things to work through. And for our viewers who are murder, suicide, loss survivors, what are some of the ways in which they can get support?
Yeah, I think we have to really be proactive and seek out support in this case for sure. I mean, because of the lack of resources, it takes a little more detective work to kind of do that, and persistence to find help. And that can be really hard when you're grieving, to do that. So obviously that's part of the reason why I created my Grief Connection, to kind of help bridge that gap a little bit. And I'm not the only resource website out there. There's lots of other ones, but for sure they can come to my website and find resources there. And I think for me, finding a really good counselor and therapist was very important. Someone who really understands grief and loss and trauma, preferably, because I think murder-suicide loss is pretty traumatic. I can't think of a case where, especially if you're a close family member, very close to the victim or the perpetrator, where it wouldn't have a traumatic effect. So I think it's really important to get good support from someone that has some training in trauma, and can, even if it's just for a few sessions, it would be helpful, I think. So you have to keep searching. You have to be persistent to find a good counselor and find someone that's a good fit for you. So I do have a PDF on my website that people could download called Finding the Right Grief Therapist, and that has a lot of helpful tips and hints. There's several therapy directories on there where you can search for a specific kind of therapist or a specific type of treatment or your area. So that's a good place to start if you're looking for that. If you, through your work, they may have an EAP program, which is an employee assistance program, and usually they will help you find a counselor and give you 5 or 6 free sessions per incident per year. So that's a good place if you need help finding something and getting, if you're struggling with how much it might cost or something, you can get some free sessions that way. And then, or get a referral from a doctor or friend. Also, there's some grief support apps out there that can be helpful. They're not specific to murder suicide, but they are good support resources, and they can help you get you through in between your counseling sessions or your support groups. There's the Grief Refuge app is a good one. The Grief Coach, Actively Moving Forward. So there's several different grief apps out there that can be like having grief support in your pocket, 24/7. Some of them allow you to match up with another survivor of a similar type of loss that maybe is a little bit more down the line, and they can help give you some mentorship and help that way. So that's an option. And then I would just really encourage you to try to find and connect with other survivors, which I know is hard because how do you search for that online? There's not really great search terms. When you search murder, suicide, loss, you find all the headlines and very few resources. But I am giving a free gift that I'll talk about later, but that does have a lot of support resources, and including the murder, suicide, loss support group that I help co-lead. So people are welcome to check that out and contact me if they want more information about the group. You could also join a suicide loss group or a homicide loss group, or both, depending on the scenario that you're in. There are there are quite a few suicide loss support groups, maybe not as many homicide loss support groups, but there are some of those. There's a group called Homicide Survivors out there, and they do quite a few online support groups and some in-person groups. You can also just Google the name of your state and the words homicide survivors. If you Google those, you probably find a lot of states actually do have like a homicide support organization that's kind of specific with resources for that area. So that's an idea to try to find more groups or more support. And then you might want to join a local group that has something to do with your specific kind of loss, like the relationship part of the loss. So like if you've lost a child or a sibling, a friend, a spouse, a partner, a parent, there are a lot of specific grief groups for those types of losses. The Compassionate Friends is a great one. And they're all over the US. You can go to griefanonymous.com or grief.com, and they actually have a directory listing on their websites for grief groups, and you can put in your zip code and find grief groups near you. And then I do have a page on my website, mygriefconnection.org/support groups, and there's a lot of lists of different support groups on there. Facebook too is a good place to go. If you just put a search in the search bar for grief support groups or for your type of grief, you will find there actually a lot of private Facebook groups for grief support, and that can be very helpful. And even just if there's children involved or in a loss, or maybe their parent was the perpetrator or the victim, they need support too. So there are lots of actual there are grieving centers around the country that support families and children. The Dougie Center is probably the most famous one that I know of, and there's a lot of other centers that they have trained. So check out the Dougie Center's website. There's also an organization called teammercy.org, and they provide support for children who have lost siblings by any kind of loss. And then the state of Georgia actually does have some documents, some support documents for helping children and families that are dealing with a domestic violence, murder, suicide loss. So, there's lots of support groups or support pages, grief accounts on Instagram. And I would also do some searching there, and just surround yourself with support. I think, whichever way you can is important. And you can connect with loss and grief organizations as well, like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention or TAPS.org. That's a military loss website. So they help support families who've lost someone to suicide or murder suicide through that are involved somehow with the military. And then, I just recommend people read a lot of articles and books and things. There's not a ton of books about murder suicide loss out there. There's a few. The Perversion of Virtue by Dr. Thomas Joyner is a really good one. There's a memoir by musician Alison Moorer called Blood that talks about the loss that she experienced when her father took the life of her mother and himself when she was a teenager. And then there's Sue Klebold, who is the mother of Dylan Klebold, who was involved with the Columbine shootings. She wrote a book called A Mother's Reckoning about her experience. And to me, that one was very helpful as well. Yeah. And then my co-leader in my group, her name is Brittany Noble McCarthy, and she wrote a great article that's on the TAPS.org website called Breaking the Silence as a Survivor of Murder-Suicide Loss. And she talks about the death of her father and stepmother in a murder-suicide. And that article was really important for me, and it's how I connected with her. So, and then I think just finding modalities for healing and outlets for self-care are really critical. And that's, that's been super important in my personal grief journey. Doing things like journaling and writing letters. I've written letters to my brother, and I've written letters from him to me, and those have been extremely healing and helpful. And you could write letters to the victims, or or just journal. Anything you can do to kind of get those thoughts out, is very helpful. I think for me, leaning into my faith, really prayer and meditation, reading scripture, being involved with my church group and my faith beliefs has really helped me a lot. So if that's something that speaks to you, I would do recommend that,
Yeah.
really leaning into your faith. Creating art, or just doing things that are expressive and let you get out your emotions, even just coloring or making collages. Like if you don't feel like you're an artist or don't, like I don't know how to do that, that's okay. You don't have to be an artist. It's about the process, not the product. And then just creating meaningful rituals, things that honor your loved one and that continue to build bonds between you and them, and that help you feel that connection with them because they're still with you, And an important thing too is setting boundaries, saying no, just trying to really preserve your personal space and energy when you're going through this. This is a lot of work. If there's a lot of processing happening, it takes a lot of energy and time. So, just recognizing that you need what your needs are, and expressing those, and then also setting boundaries to be able to allow yourself to have your needs met, is important. Just all that body care stuff is important. Drinking water, taking naps, walks, spending time in nature, getting massages, acupuncture, eating good food, getting sleep, super important. All that stuff is very important. And just finding someone to talk to, whether it's a therapist or not, it doesn't have to be, but I find that really helpful. But there are listening lines out there that you can call pretty much at all hours, and just talk to someone that will listen with empathy to you. There's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. There's your local suicide prevention hotlines. Even if you yourself are not feeling suicidal, but you are dealing with this loss, you can call and they are happy to just listen and help you. So don't ever hesitate to call if you're needing someone to talk to. They're available 24/7. And just finding friends and family members that are able to hear and to hear you and hold space for you is important. Not everyone can. So knowing which friends and family member can listen and help is very important. I would say one tip is to grieve outwardly. Don't grieve in, and that means, if there's someone closer to the person that died, so maybe like, your parents lost a child, but you're the sibling. It's okay to talk to your parents about it to some degree, but you might want to express your grief outwardly more, to maybe find a friend, find a counselor, someone outside of that immediate circle to talk to. And I feel like that's more helpful, and because sometimes you'll find people in your outer circle that are friends that'll come to you looking for support for your loss, and that's really hard because that puts so much burden on you, and you're like, I'm the one that needs you for support, and so that can be an awkward dynamic. So I guess just keeping that in mind is helpful. And there are other survivors or clergy. There are people out there that are willing to listen, and you just might have to look around a little and keep trying, but it's just really important to talk about it, because the more we talk about it, the less shame we feel, the more out in the open, in the light it is, the less shameful it feels. And that's really, what helped me a lot is like dispelling the shame part of it, and now I can talk about it, and I don't feel like it's my burden that I'm carrying as much, you know what I mean? Like it's lightened it a lot, and so I can actually talk about it, and I'm not a big bawling mess every time. Sometimes I am still, but not every time, and that's really important.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. There were some great tips and advice out there, and some useful websites and resources, so our viewers can go and have a look and check them out. And we mentioned before that you run a support group for murder suicide loss survivors, and you're co-leading that.
Yes.
How can murder suicide loss survivors contact you about joining, and how does it work? What is it all about?
Okay. Yeah. So as far as we know, we're the only murder suicide loss survivor support group in the US that's active. We can't find any others, so we think we're kind of alone in this. But my co-leader Brittany Noble McCarthy and I started the group back in November, and it's been going strong since then. We meet twice a month. So we're a peer-led group, so it's a kind of a hybrid of a traditional support group and an action group. And we welcome those that are interested in either or both to come. It's about a 90-minute long meeting usually. We try to kind of divide it to accommodate attendees who are interested in either that traditional support or the advocacy kind of part of it, the action and advocacy part, or some people like to stay for both. So we meet every other Friday evening via Zoom at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. And yeah, we just founded this group because we want to provide hope for this community that's experiencing this. You know, it's a pretty rare type of loss, but unfortunately it does happen every day in the US. About 11 times a week in the US is average. And if you identify as a survivor of this kind of loss or have faced this loss somehow, or you're not sure, you know, where you fit or how to get help, we just provide the supportive circle that lets you explore healing and lets you connect with other survivors. So we welcome all survivors of murder, suicide, loss, however you're related, you know, whatever your relationship is to those that died. So, you know, sometimes, I guess, let me explain a little bit too, you know, if you are surviving the loss of a sibling or a step sibling loss, if the parents, step parents, in-laws, friends, or if you witnessed a murder suicide, or you know, just somehow it was like really closely kind of connected with you, or, you know, maybe you witnessed it but you weren't connected with the victim or the perpetrator. That happens sometimes. Or you know, attempted murder suicide survivors, like all of those kind of things, you know, are welcome if anyone feels like they connect or relate to those descriptions, I guess. And but they would just want to reach out to either Brittany or I. We have people just email us usually and let us know that they're interested, and then we will set up a little initial phone call or a video call with one of us. So we just kind of get a sense of your story and get to meet you and see if you know, our group would be a good fit. And we want to ensure safety and privacy of all the group members, so we just feel that's an important step. And we need people to be 18 or older to join the group. And we ask that they are currently seeking counseling or are in professional counseling or therapy, like they're actively seeking help, or they have like a willingness to seek help in the future. And because we're not professionals, you know, this is a peer-led group, and we want people to be safe and actively pursuing healing on their own, as well as, you know, getting support from the group. And then we ask that they are willing to share their contact information with us so that we can provide emergency help if that's ever needed. So just important for that. And yeah, so they can just reach out. They can email. That information, I think, will be in the PDF that they can download. They can get our details there.
Okay, perfect. And I remember from speaking to you before, another sort of situation where you said people sometimes don't know if they qualify as a murder suicide loss survivor, is if the murder takes part on one day and then the suicide takes place a few days later. And I know we were talking, you said that still counts as a murder suicide loss. So if that's the case for any of our viewers, then they're also very welcome to get in touch. And like you said, if they're unsure, you know, it's a friendly chat. I know you're very open, very happy to help, so they can get in touch. And I'm grateful that you're providing the support and the space for people, especially as you said, you're currently the only support group out there. So I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. It's
So
an honor.
So wrapping up then, if you were to leave our viewers with one single action today, what would it be?
You know, I would encourage them to take advantage of the free gift that I'm offering, to download that PDF. I mean, it's not just for murder, suicide, loss survivors. I think there's a lot of helpful resources in there for survivors of suicide loss, but also for those that want to be supportive, you know, to those that are going through something like this. To have those resources on hand is very helpful. You never know when you might need them, you know. So and just to, maybe educate yourself about murder-suicide loss a little bit more, because I think a lot of people just, they don't really know very much about it, or don't understand how it feels for survivors to kind of go through that experience. They just sort of know what they know from the news headlines and what they read on, you know, the Facebook posts and things like that. And so I think just educating yourself a little bit is really important. And that always, I think, builds empathy, you know, and helps us understand, have understanding. And I think that's really important. So I guess that's what I would say is, you know, to spend a little time educating yourself about murder-suicide loss, whether or not you're directly affected by it right now. You know, these things are happening more and more frequently, it seems like, and like in the news every week, it seems like there's a story about an incident like this. So we're not all going to be unaffected for very long. Eventually, you know, it might be something that comes into your sphere. So you know, that would help us survivors, the more people that are kind of more educated about the topic and understand and have a little bit more empathy.
Yeah. And you mentioned the free gift, and we'll put the link to download beneath the video. So
Sure.
did you say it is a PDF with resources? Can you say a bit more about it?
Yeah, it's a PDF called Grief Resources for Murder-Suicide Loss Survivors. It's got like clickable links to resources that to like suicide prevention and postvention organizations, to articles, to blog posts, to audio interviews and books, just everything I could find about murder-suicide loss, or that I think would be applicable. Some of it isn't specific to murder-suicide loss per se, but it would be helpful for people going through that, because like I said, there's not all that much out there. But I tried to put something together that, like, this is, if someone had given me this document right after I lost my brother, you know, it would have been extremely helpful, and I would have had a place to start with, you know, to start getting support and looking for help. So I tried to just consolidate all the most helpful resources that I could find, and things that I wish that I had you know, to give people some place to go from. And it might be something that you might someday, you know, need to pass along to someone who maybe does go through this kind of loss. So it's a good thing to have handy, and to be just kind of aware of what's available. So
definitely. Thank you so much for putting that together, and thank you so much again for speaking with us today. Do you have any final thoughts?
I just, you know, just want to send my love and support for all of those watching today, regardless of why you're here, you know, whether you've lost someone to suicide personally that you know, or you've lost someone to murder-suicide, or you're in the grief kind of industry or field, I guess, and wanting to support other survivors. I mean, I just want to thank you for taking the time to be here, to educate yourself, and to seek support, and to seek connection and community, because I think those are the keys really to finding that healing and hope that we all long for, is, you know, connecting with others and finding community. And I just think I just want to thank you for being here, and congratulate you for taking this step to care for yourself, and to seek out support. So I guess that's all. Just wanted to thank everybody.
Thank you so much for those beautiful words, Sara, and thank you again for talking to us. And to our viewers, be sure to tune in to our next interviews for more valuable advice and support on your suicide bereavement journey. Until then, take care, and see you in the next interview. Bye-bye.